Okay, so before we get into the big reveal, let us set the scene. Imagine a low, dusty hill rising out of the dry flatlands of southeastern Turkey. The wind comes across the plateau in long, steady gusts. There are no obvious signs that anything remarkable is here. No dramatic cliffs, no sparkling river, no ancient ruins sticking out of the ground in any obvious way. Just a rounded hill, some scattered limestone rocks on the surface, and the kind of sun-baked silence that makes a place feel old in a way that is hard to explain. That hill is called Göbekli Tepe. The name is Turkish, and it translates to something like Potbelly Hill. Not exactly the most dramatic name in the world. It does not sound like the kind of place that would upend everything historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists thought they knew about human civilization. It sounds like the kind of place you would drive past without slowing down, but buried inside that hill is something so ancient, so sophisticated, and so completely at odds with the standard story of human history that the discovery of it has forced serious scientists to go back to the beginning and rethink almost everything. Here is what you need to understand before we go any further. For a long, long time, archaeologists had a story, a neat, logical, step-by-step story about how civilization developed. It went something like this. Human beings started out as hunter-gatherers. They wandered around following herds of animals, picking wild plants, living in temporary shelters, and surviving day to day with no real sense of permanence. Then, about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. People figured out how to farm. They planted seeds, grew their own food, and stopped having to move around all the time. Farming meant surplus food. Surplus food meant some people did not have to spend all their time growing or hunting. They could do other things. They could become specialists, builders, priests, administrators, artists. And from that specialization, organized religion grew, and monumental architecture grew. And eventually, cities and empires and everything we think of when we hear the word civilization. It was a sensible story. It fit the evidence gathered over more than a century of archaeological work. And then someone started digging at Potbelly Hill, and the whole thing fell apart. What they found underneath that dry Turkish hillside was a massive, complex, deliberately built ritual site, a site of stone enclosures, enormous carved pillars, and detailed artistic carvings of animals and abstract symbols. A site that was, by every dating technique available to modern science, approximately 11,500 years old. That is older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than writing by roughly 6,000 years, older than the earliest known farming communities by a significant margin. And it was not crude. It was not primitive. It was extraordinary. That is why the story of Göbekli Tepe matters, not just as an archaeological curiosity, but as direct, physical, undeniable evidence that the story we have been telling about human civilization was wrong. Significantly, fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. Let us talk about exactly how wrong. The strange thing about Göbekli Tepe is that it was not exactly hidden. It did not take extraordinary detective work to find it. It was just sitting there on a hill that people had been walking across, farming on, and living near for generations. The reason it took so long to be recognized for what it is comes down to a single misidentification made by a smart, experienced archaeologist who looked at something unusual and saw something ordinary. In 1963, teams from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago conducted a wide archaeological survey across southeastern Turkey. This was a serious, well-funded academic project designed to map the region's archaeological landscape and identify sites that might warrant future excavation. They came to the hill we now call Göbekli Tepe. They walked across its surface. They noted the scattered limestone fragments and the flint tools they found there. An American archaeologist named Peter Benedict examined the stone tools and correctly identified them as belonging to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, meaning they predated the invention of pottery, which already made them very old. That was a real, accurate, important observation. But then Benedict looked at the tops of what were actually massive prehistoric stone pillars poking up through the surface of the hill, and he concluded they were ordinary grave markers, headstones, nothing worth a deep investigation. He was not being careless. The tops of those T-shaped pillars, weathered and partially buried, genuinely could look like grave markers to someone who had no frame of reference for what a 12,000-year-old megalithic monument complex looked like. There was no reason in 1963 to expect you might be standing on top of the world's oldest known religious construction site. So the survey team moved on, filed their report, and the hill sat undisturbed for another 30 years. During those 30 years, local farmers continued to plow the fields on the hill, cutting their furrows through soil just meters above carvings that had not been seen by human eyes for over 12,000 years. The family that owned the land, the Yildiz family, had been turning up strange pieces of worked limestone for years during their plowing. They reported these finds to the Archaeological Museum in Şanlıurfa, the nearby provincial city. The museum filed the reports. Nothing came of it right away. And then came 1994, and a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. Schmidt was working with the German Archaeological Institute and had spent years excavating a nearby Neolithic site called Novala Chori. That site had produced its own remarkable finds, specifically T-shaped stone pillars. Schmidt was now doing something that good field archaeologists do periodically, going back through old survey reports and secondary literature, looking with fresh eyes at sites that had been noted and then set aside. He came across the 1963 survey's description of the Potbelly Hill. He read about the scattered limestone, the flint tools, the supposed grave markers. And because he had spent years working with T-shaped Neolithic pillars at Novala Chori, something clicked immediately. He recognized the description. Those were not grave markers. Those were megaliths. He was confident of it before he had even left his desk. Schmidt traveled to Göbekli Tepe in 1994, and by every account, including his own, knew within minutes that he was standing on something extraordinary. He reportedly said that in 1 year of excavation, everything he had known about the development of human culture was about to be disproved. He began formal excavations in 1995, and what came out of the ground over the following 2 decades would rewrite the textbooks. Or at least it should have, but we will get to that. Let us talk about the structures themselves, because people sometimes hear ancient stone monument and picture something relatively simple, a circle of rough rocks, a pile of boulders arranged in a vague pattern, something that requires a lot of imagination to be impressed by. Göbekli Tepe is not that, not even close. The site consists of large enclosures, roughly circular or oval in shape, built from stone walls with massive T-shaped limestone pillars set into them at regular intervals. Each enclosure has, in addition to the pillars set into the walls, 2 larger central pillars standing in the middle of the space, taller than the others, oriented along a specific axis. These central pillars dominate the interior of each enclosure the way columns in a cathedral dominate the space around them. They are the focal point. Everything else is organized around them. Now here is where you need to pause and really let the numbers sink in. The largest of these T-shaped pillars stand up to 5 meters tall. That is about 16 feet, roughly the height of a 2-story building. And they weigh somewhere between 10 and 50 tons each. They were quarried from limestone bedrock in the hills nearby, shaped into their T-form using stone tools, no metal, no advanced machinery, and then transported to their positions and erected. The surfaces of these pillars are covered in detailed carved imagery. Animals, snakes, foxes, lions, bulls, wild boars, scorpions, vultures, cranes, ducks, gazelles, spiders, aurochs, abstract symbols, geometric shapes, H-shapes, crescents, lines that researchers have been trying to decode for decades. And on some of the central pillars, something even more striking, arms, hands, belts, the outlines of a human or human-like body carved in relief, turning these stone pillars into figures, into beings with presence and identity. These are not just architectural supports, they are representations of something. Whether that something is gods, ancestors, spirits, or some category of entity for which we do not have a word, the pillars were meant to be understood as persons, entities, presences in the space. The four most thoroughly excavated enclosures, called Enclosure A, B, C, and D, were built during the oldest phase of the site's use, dated to around 9500 to 9000 BCE. Enclosure D is the biggest and oldest, and it contains some of the most famous carved surfaces at the entire site. Each enclosure contains roughly 12 to 14 pillars in total, and the interiors of some contain stone benches, suggesting that people sat in these spaces, gathered, waited, observed, participated in whatever rituals took place here. The stone between the pillars is carefully fitted. The floors are carefully laid. This is not a pile of rocks that happen to end up in an interesting arrangement. This is the product of careful planning, skilled labor, and a sustained collective effort that must have taken years per enclosure to complete. And here is the part that really gets people. There are no hearths at Göbekli Tepe, no cooking fires, no food storage pits, no trash middens of the kind you find at every normal habitation site. This was not a village. This was not a campsite. People came here for specific purposes, did specific things here, and then left. Okay, so we have established that what has been excavated at Göbekli Tepe is remarkable. But here is the part of the story that does not get nearly enough attention. What has been excavated so far is a tiny fraction of what is actually there. Geophysical surveys, using ground-penetrating radar and a technique called magnetometry, have revealed what lies beneath the surface of the hill. And what they reveal is staggering. The surveys show at least 20 complete enclosures buried in the mound. Some estimates push that number higher, based on the pattern established by the four excavated enclosures. Each of those buried enclosures likely contains around 12 megalithic pillars. Run the math and you get a total of over 200 T-shaped stone pillars buried within the single hill. Approximately 128 of those estimated 200 pillars have never been seen since they were covered over thousands of years ago. They are sitting in the dark right now, underneath the Turkish hillside, exactly as they were left, and here is the number that really puts the scale of this in perspective. The full excavation of Göbekli Tepe, conducted at the careful, methodical pace that proper archaeological science requires, has been estimated to require approximately 150 years to complete. Not 15 years, not 50 years, 150 years. That estimate came from Dr. Mehmet Onal of Harran University, and it was not hyperbole. Think about what that means. Klaus Schmidt began serious excavation in 1995. If the estimate holds, the work at this site will not be finished until somewhere around 2145. The people who will complete the excavation of Göbekli Tepe have not yet been born. Students who will be doing some of the most significant work at this site in the 2060s and 2070s are right now sitting in primary school, or maybe not yet conceived. Whatever is in the deepest, most undisturbed layers of this hill will not be known by anyone alive today. There is also a quarry at the site that adds another dimension to all of this. During excavations, the team found a partially shaped pillar still attached to the bedrock from which it was being cut. This pillar was abandoned mid-construction, for reasons we do not know. It measures approximately 7 meters in length, about 23 feet, and would have weighed around 50 tons when finished. This unfinished pillar was never completed, never erected, never carved, but its existence tells us that the builders were capable of creating structures even larger than the impressive ones we have already found. The ambition embedded in this place goes beyond what is currently visible. Here is where the standard story of human history runs into its most serious crisis, and where the implications of this discovery become genuinely hard to wrap your head around. The structures at Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 9500 BCE that places them in what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period that, as the name tells you, predates the invention of pottery. It also predates agriculture as an established practice in this region. It predates permanent human settlements, at least by the definition that was in use before this discovery. The people who built this site are believed to have been hunter-gatherers, people who lived by following game and gathering wild plants, people who, according to every assumption that mainstream archaeology had built up over more than a century of research, should not have been able to do what the evidence at this site proves they did. This is the core paradox of Göbekli Tepe, and it is enormous. The conventional reasoning went like this. Monumental construction requires a settled society. You need surplus food to feed workers who are not farming or hunting. You need a stable social hierarchy to organize labor at scale. You need a fixed geographic location to justify the massive investment of building something permanent. Nomadic people do not build permanent monuments. Why would they? They are always moving. Göbekli Tepe proves that reasoning was wrong. The radiocarbon dating is solid, well replicated, and not seriously disputed. The site was in active use from approximately 9500 BCE and possibly earlier, running through to around 8000 BCE. The earliest occupied layers clearly predate any established evidence of domesticated crops or animals in the surrounding region. And yet the structures are there, the carvings are there, and the scale of the construction effort is undeniable. After years of careful excavation, Klaus Schmidt concluded that Göbekli Tepe was not a habitation site. People did not live here permanently. They came here, they gathered here, they built here, and then they dispersed again. Lee Clare, who became the lead archaeologist at the site in more recent years, describes it as a gathering place for hunter-gatherer groups from a wide surrounding area. People drawn here seasonally, taking advantage of the landscape's natural resources during predictable periods of abundance, particularly the great gazelle migrations that moved through this region, and the wild grains that grew on the slopes below the ridge. Turkish archaeologist Ahmet Yavuzkir summarized the reversal this discovery demands in about as clear terms as you can find anywhere. Before Göbekli Tepe, the assumption was that farming created civilization, that everything began with agriculture, that the capacity for large-scale organized activity grew out of settled farming life. Now that assumption is reversed. Hunter-gatherers built this site. The monument came before the farm. Now everything is reversed. Sit with that for a moment. Klaus Schmidt himself proposed a hypothesis that has since become one of the most debated ideas in the entire field. He suggested that instead of agriculture enabling the construction of temples, it may have been the other way around. That the need to feed large numbers of people gathering at a ritual site like this one created the pressure and incentive to begin cultivating wild grain nearby. The temple first, the farm as a consequence of the temple. Not civilization producing religion, but religion producing civilization. Walk through the excavated enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, and you are surrounded by imagery. Imagery carved with skill, arranged with evident intent, organized in compositions that clearly mean something, and yet you cannot quite read it. You recognize the animals. You can see the snake coiling down the surface of a pillar, the fox with its sharp profile, the long neck of a crane, the bulk of a wild bull with its curving horns. But the meaning behind the specific combinations, the specific placement, the specific choices remains frustratingly out of reach. Snakes appear constantly, dozens of them, on pillars across multiple enclosures, rendered in long, sinuous relief that feels almost alive. They coil down from the tops of pillars toward the bases, climb across the surfaces of stone walls, appear in combinations with other animals. Whatever role the snake played in the symbolic world of the people who built this place, it was clearly central. Foxes appear with a frequency that most researchers agree is not accidental. They show up on multiple pillars, in multiple enclosures, across different phases of the site's long history of use. Some researchers believe the fox occupied a specific symbolic role in the cosmological framework of the builders, possibly connected to a particular constellation, possibly associated with specific ritual functions. The honest answer is that we do not know for certain, but the consistency of the fox's presence across the site makes it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Vultures appear prominently, and given what we know about the ritual treatment of the dead at this site, their presence carries a weight that is hard to ignore. Vultures feed on the dead. They are creatures that stand at the boundary between life and death, transforming death into the continuation of life in the most literal biological sense. In later religious traditions across the ancient Near East, vultures were frequently associated with the journey of the dead, the passage from one realm to another. Whether those later associations have any continuity with what vultures meant at Göbekli Tepe is unknown, but their prominence here is not an accident. The abstract symbols at the site are particularly intriguing. Among the most studied are the H shapes, geometric carved forms that appear on multiple pillars across multiple enclosures, and that are clearly not representations of anything in the physical world. They are abstract, deliberate, repeated, and their repetition across different structures, built across a period of hundreds of years, strongly suggests they carried a consistent meaning, a meaning widely understood by the community that used this site. One researcher has proposed that these H symbols, combined with crescent shapes that also appear at the site, may represent an early form of a word or concept for something divine, possibly a proto-language equivalent of the word God. That interpretation is speculative and should be understood as such. But even the fact that it is a plausible speculation tells you something about the depth of symbolic thinking these carvings represent. Then there is the most famous pillar at the entire site, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. This carved surface has generated more analysis, more debate, and more fascination than almost any other single artifact in the history of the site. At its center, a large vulture is depicted with a circular disc resting on one of its wings. Below the vulture, a scorpion symbol. Around these central figures are additional images: a headless human body, a fox, several smaller symbols and abstract forms. The overall arrangement feels like a sentence, like something specific is being communicated in a visual language you cannot quite decode. And as we will discuss in detail shortly, some researchers believe that is exactly what it is: a message, a specific, deliberate, encoded message about an event that shook the entire world. The central T-shaped pillars, the tall, dominant figures at the heart of each enclosure, are in a category of their own when it comes to human representation. On Pillar 18 in Enclosure D, the surface is carved with arms running down its sides, hands resting at what would be the abdomen, a belt carved around what would be the waist, and what appears to be a fox pelt loincloth hanging from that belt. This pillar has a body. It has posture. Its arms are positioned in a way that reads as composed and deliberate, like a figure standing formally, with authority, in a specific pose that meant something specific to whoever designed it. These central pillar figures are beings. They were understood as beings with identity, with presence, with significance. Whether they are gods, deified ancestors, spirit entities, or something else entirely, is a question that archaeology alone may never be able to answer. But they are not abstract architectural elements. They are, in the fullest sense of the word, characters, and the enclosures that surround them are stages on which something very specific and probably very important was performed. Just when you thought the basic picture of Göbekli Tepe was settled enough to build on, researchers published findings in 2017 that added a dimension nobody had fully seen coming, and that made the site even more remarkable and even darker than it had already appeared. The paper was published in the prestigious journal Science Advances, and it described 3 partially preserved human skulls found at the site. These were not ordinary skulls, and what had been done to them was not ordinary treatment of the dead. Each skull had been deliberately, carefully modified. They bore deep carved incisions, cut marks that followed the natural contours of the bone in patterns that were clearly intentional rather than the result of damage, decay, or accident. They also had carved grooves running along the surface of the cranium, creating lines and channels that researchers had never seen before at any other site from this period anywhere in the world. Traces of red ochre, the iron-rich pigment that appears in ritual contexts at prehistoric sites across the globe, had been applied to some of the skull fragments, and evidence suggested that some of the skulls had been drilled or pierced in a way that would have allowed them to be hung, displayed, or carried. The research team concluded that these skulls represented evidence of a previously undocumented form of skull cult, a set of practices involving the special, ritualized treatment of human skulls after death, whether this was about honoring and preserving the presence of important ancestors, or about displaying the skulls of defeated enemies as symbols of power and warning, or about both, or about something entirely different that we do not have a cultural framework for. The team could not say with certainty. What is clear is that these skulls were not randomly discarded. They were treated as objects of meaning, objects worth preserving and marking and possibly displaying as part of the ongoing ritual life of the site. And this finding does not stand alone. The carved imagery at Göbekli Tepe includes representations of headless human bodies, bodies without heads, carved in relief on pillar surfaces. There are depictions of vultures and other raptors interacting with what appear to be severed human heads, and there is a remarkable small limestone sculpture found at the site, sometimes called the gift bearer, that shows a kneeling figure holding a human head in its hands, with the eyes and nose of the head clearly and carefully rendered. Put all of this together, the modified skulls, the headless body carvings, the raptor and head imagery, the gift bearer sculpture. The picture that emerges is of a community for which the boundary between life and death was not something to be managed quietly and privately, but something to be engaged with directly, ceremonially, and on a significant scale. Death was not peripheral to the spiritual life of Göbekli Tepe. By every piece of evidence available, death was close to the center of it. Here is the thing that stops you cold when you sit with all of this. These were people living 11,000 years ago. No writing, no pottery, no metal tools, no agriculture in the established sense. And they were building elaborate stone enclosures decorated with carefully chosen imagery, conducting ritualized treatments of human skulls involving carving and pigment application and possibly public display, and engaging with the deepest, most universal questions of human existence. What happens when we die? What are the forces that govern the world? How do we relate to those forces? What do the dead ask of the living? The questions are older than any civilization we have a written record of. They may have been born, or at least first monumentalized, at Putbelly Hill. Now we get to the part of the Göbekli Tepe story that generates the most heated debate, the most popular fascination, and the most careful disagreement among researchers. And it centers almost entirely on one carved surface, Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. In 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis published an analysis in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, making a striking argument. They proposed that the animal symbols carved on Pillar 43 were not just religious imagery or decorative art. They were astronomical. Specifically, they argued that the arrangement of animal symbols on the pillar corresponded to constellations as they would have appeared in the night sky at a specific, precise moment in time, a moment that the researchers identified as approximately 10,950 BCE. And why that date? Because 10,950 BCE is the approximate date of an event known as the Younger Dryas Impact, a proposed cosmic collision involving a comet or asteroid that is thought by a growing number of scientists to have struck the Earth and triggered a sudden dramatic cooling of the global climate that lasted for about 1,200 years. The Younger Dryas climate episode itself is well documented in geological records around the world. It shows up clearly in ice cores, lake sediments, and soil profiles. What remains actively debated is whether it was caused by an extraterrestrial impact. But a significant body of evidence, including the discovery of nanodiamonds, glassy spherules, and other impact-related markers in sediment layers from this exact time period at sites across multiple continents, has kept the hypothesis alive and scientifically credible. Sweatman and Sikritsis argued that the builders of Göbekli Tepe, or their cultural ancestors, witnessed this catastrophic event and preserved a record of it in the carvings of Pillar 43. The vulture with the disc, the scorpion below it, the headless body, the fox. In their interpretation, each of these represents a specific constellation positioned in the sky at the moment of impact, encoded using a system based on the slow, predictable wobble of the Earth's axis known as the precession of the equinoxes. More recent work by Sweatman extended this analysis even further, proposing that Pillar 43 also encodes what may be the earliest known solar calendar, and that the construction of that calendar required arithmetic. The earliest known arithmetic, if this interpretation is correct, was performed not on a clay tablet in Mesopotamia, but on a carved stone pillar roughly 11,000 years old in southeastern Turkey. That is an extraordinary claim. The kind of claim that demands extraordinary evidence and that the scientific community is right to scrutinize with great care, and scrutinize it they have. Critics of the Sweatman-Sikritsis interpretation have raised legitimate concerns. Among them is the risk of finding patterns you are already looking for, of fitting the animal to constellation correspondences to the date, rather than independently deriving the date from the carvings. Some mainstream archaeologists treat the astronomical interpretation of Pillar 43 as speculative, noting that the carved imagery could carry religious or mythological meaning without any astronomical coding at all. But here is what is not in serious dispute. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were carefully observant of the sky. Geophysical surveys of the site revealed that the arrangement of at least 3 enclosures creates a nearly perfect equilateral triangle. You do not accidentally create a nearly perfect equilateral triangle on the surface of a hill while building stone enclosures. You plan it. Planning it requires spatial reasoning that is closely related to the kind of systematic observation involved in tracking celestial movements. The site is also positioned on a ridge with a wide, commanding view of the horizon in multiple directions, a positioning that makes sense if the builders were interested in observing specific solar, lunar, or stellar events from this location. And the broader cultural logic is hard to argue with. Every major ancient civilization for which we have substantial records was deeply preoccupied with the sky. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the builders of Stonehenge, the Maya, the astronomers of the Indus Valley. All of them tracked celestial movements, built their calendars around astronomical events, and constructed monuments with specific astronomical orientations. The idea that the people who built Göbekli Tepe also paid close attention to the sky and built that attention into the structures they created is not a stretch. It is what you would expect. One of the most fascinating and most debated aspects of Göbekli Tepe's story is how it came to be buried in the first place. Because the site was not simply covered over by the natural accumulation of sediment over thousands of years. Something more specific happened here, and figuring out exactly what is a question that researchers have been arguing about for years. For much of the site's modern research history, including during the long excavation led by Klaus Schmidt, the dominant interpretation was that the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe had been deliberately and intentionally filled, that the people who built and used this place chose at some point to bury it, to fill the enclosures with rubble, soil, and debris, covering the pillars and carvings, sealing the whole complex in the earth. The reasoning behind this interpretation was not purely speculative. The fill material inside the enclosures appeared to be unnatural in character, not the kind of gradual, random debris accumulation you see when a site is simply abandoned and left to the elements. The fill was denser, more mixed, and contained a combination of flint tools, animal bones, and worked stone fragments that seemed consistent with deliberate, active dumping. Somebody had put this material here. Somebody had filled these spaces on purpose. And the idea had deep cultural resonance. In many religious traditions across history, when a sacred space is retired from active use, it must be decommissioned carefully. The power believed to inhabit a sacred place does not simply evaporate when the worshippers stop coming. It lingers, concentrated in the physical location, dangerous to anyone who might accidentally transgress against it without proper understanding. To protect future generations from inadvertent desecration, the sacred space must be sealed, returned to the earth, marked as inviolable, closed off from ordinary human use. Burying the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe would, in this reading, have been one of the most profound acts of ritual reverence imaginable. A community saying to whatever forces they had invoked and honored here, "We are finished, but we have not forgotten. We are returning this to you." That interpretation remains compelling and has not been entirely abandoned. But in recent years, the picture has become more complicated. Dr. Lee Clare, who became the lead excavation archaeologist at the site after Schmidt's death in 2014, has publicly stated that the idea of a single, intentional, comprehensive burial event no longer fits the evidence as well as it once seemed to. New research points to a more complex history, a series of slope events, landslides, and the gradual encroachment of sediment from the surrounding hillside, combined with evidence that the site's inhabitants built retaining walls in an apparent attempt to prevent the structures from being covered over. The site was not buried all at once. It was buried gradually by a combination of forces over an extended period. The retaining walls are particularly interesting. If the builders were trying to keep the structures from being buried, building walls specifically to hold back encroaching soil, that suggests the burial was something happening against their wishes, not something they were deliberately choosing to do. It suggests a community fighting to preserve a sacred space rather than choosing to seal it. What is not in dispute is the result. Göbekli Tepe was buried deeply and completely enough to be effectively invisible for 12,000 years. The farmers who plowed the fields on that hill for generations had no idea what they were farming above. The archaeologists who surveyed it in 1963 saw only scattered surface fragments, and the great majority of what is there remains in the dark right now, exactly as it was left, waiting the dark right now, exactly as it was left, waiting. Here is a claim that some scholars make with confidence and others resist with equal force, but that the evidence at this site pushes toward in a way that is hard to redirect. Göbekli Tepe may be the birthplace of organized religion, not religion in the sense of private, internal spiritual experience. That is almost certainly as old as human consciousness itself. But organized, collective, architectural religion, the kind that brings groups of people together in shared sacred spaces, channels belief into constructed physical form, maintains specific symbolic frameworks across generations and across distance, and treats certain places and objects and practices as set apart from ordinary life. That kind of religion may have taken its first truly monumental form at a hilltop in southeastern Turkey 11,500 years ago. The evidence points that direction from multiple angles simultaneously. There are no hearths at Göbekli Tepe, no storage facilities, no ordinary domestic debris in the scale that habitation leaves behind. This was not a place where people lived their daily lives. It was a place they came to specifically for purposes distinct from the routines of daily survival. That distinction between ordinary space and sacred space is, in virtually every human religious tradition, one of the most fundamental concepts. The very idea that certain places are different, that some locations are charged with significance and power that ordinary locations lack is a religious idea. And Göbekli Tepe is the earliest physical expression of that idea that has ever been found. The scale of the construction effort implies something else important too. You do not organize the quarrying, shaping, transport, and erection of hundreds of multi-ton stone pillars over a period of 1,500 years without a compelling reason that transcends the practical. People will do extraordinary things for religious reasons, for the belief that they are doing what the powers that govern the world require of them, or that the safety and continuation of their community depends on it, or that the dead ancestors who watch over them are honored by the effort. Those are the kinds of motivations that make otherwise impossible projects possible. The skull rituals, the specific animal imagery, the anthropomorphic central pillar figures, the spatial organization of the enclosures. Everything at this site converges on a picture of a community with a complex and developed spiritual life. A community that had ideas about the cosmos, about the forces that govern it, about what lies beyond death, that were important enough and widely shared enough to justify the construction of one of the largest and most sophisticated building complexes in the history of the ancient world. Whatever name you give to what happened in those stone enclosures, prayer, ritual, ceremony, sacrifice, astronomical observation, ancestor veneration, it is what human beings have been doing in temples, churches, mosques, shrines, and sacred groves ever since. The specific beliefs change across cultures and across centuries. The form changes, the language changes. But the fundamental impulse to gather in a place set apart from ordinary life, to engage with forces or beings larger than yourself, to mark the boundary between the living and the dead, to seek protection and meaning and connection in a cosmos that is vast and indifferent and occasionally terrifying. That impulse is as old as Göbekli Tepe. One thing that sometimes gets lost in the focus on Göbekli Tepe itself is that this site was not an isolated phenomenon. It was not a single unique eruption of architectural sophistication in an otherwise uniformly simple world. There was a network. There were other sites, and as archaeological work in southeastern Turkey has accelerated over the past decade, that network has turned out to be larger and more varied than anyone initially imagined. Within the region of the Şanlıurfa Hills, an area sometimes called the Taş Tepeler, meaning stone hills, at least a dozen sites with T-shaped pillars related to those at Göbekli Tepe have been identified and are in various stages of investigation. These include Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Harbutsuvan Tepesi, and several others. Some are being actively excavated right now, and the preliminary findings from several of them are genuinely extraordinary. Karahan Tepe, located roughly 35 kilometers southeast of Göbekli Tepe, has drawn particularly intense attention in recent years. There is growing evidence that Karahan Tepe may actually be older than Göbekli Tepe, possibly the earliest known site of this type yet found. Excavations there have uncovered a remarkable chamber featuring dozens of upright stone pillars carved with human-like faces, not the abstract T-shaped tops of the Göbekli Tepe pillars, but actual faces, staring downward into the space below them from the tops of their stone shafts. The visual effect, if you look at photographs of this chamber, is arresting. It is a room full of watching faces. Karahan Tepe also contains a feature carved directly into the bedrock, a narrow passage or channel cut into the natural stone with a large stone head positioned at its terminus. The combination of elements, the carved passage leading to the stone head, suggests a ritualistic significance that researchers are still working to fully understand. What is clear is that it was not accidental or practical. It was designed to create a specific spatial and psychological experience for whoever moved through it. What does the existence of this network tell us? It tells us that Göbekli Tepe was part of a broader cultural world, a world with shared architectural conventions, shared symbolic vocabularies, shared religious or cosmological frameworks that extended across a significant region and persisted over a significant span of time. The people who built these various sites were connected. They traveled between them, influenced each other, shared ideas and techniques across distances that for people living in this period were substantial. They maintained a coherent tradition of monumental building and ritual practice across what we are now beginning to understand was a remarkably active and interconnected pre-Neolithic cultural landscape. The fundamental point is already established. Göbekli Tepe was not an accident. It was not a one-off. It was part of a cultural tradition that was widespread, sustained, and sophisticated. The people of pre-Neolithic southeastern Anatolia were not isolated bands of wanderers with no connection to anything larger than their immediate survival. They were participants in something big. Let us be direct about something that does not get said clearly enough in most popular accounts of the site. The full implications of Göbekli Tepe have not been fully absorbed by the mainstream story of human civilization. Not by textbooks, not by the popular understanding that most educated people carry around with them, not even in some cases by the academic world, which moves slowly and carefully and with good reason, but which sometimes moves so slowly that truly revolutionary findings take a generation to filter into the standard narrative. This is not a conspiracy. There is no shadowy organization suppressing the truth about Potbelly Hill. There is no government cover-up, no secret society protecting the standard timeline. The actual dynamic at work is both more mundane and, in its own way, more frustrating. It is the normal, predictable inertia of established knowledge. Academic disciplines build their models from decades of accumulated evidence. Those models are not held loosely or easily discarded. They are the product of enormous collective effort and represent the best available synthesis of everything a field collectively knows at a given moment. When new evidence appears that challenges a fundamental assumption of the model, the initial response is not immediate revision. The initial response is scrutiny, rigorous, sometimes aggressive skepticism, designed to make sure the new evidence is real, well-documented, and genuinely incompatible with the existing model before the enormous effort of revising it is undertaken. That is healthy. That is how science is supposed to work. But Göbekli Tepe passed that scrutiny. The evidence is solid. The dating is not disputed. The interpretation of the site as a sophisticated pre-agricultural ritual complex is not seriously challenged by any credible researcher. And the implication of that interpretation, that large-scale social organization, complex symbolic thought, and organized religion predate agriculture rather than arising from it, is now widely accepted among specialists in Neolithic archaeology. The problem is the gap between specialist understanding and public understanding. Most people's mental model of human prehistory still looks something like the old one. Simple hunter-gatherers stumbling gradually towards civilization, with art and religion and monumental building emerging only after farming and settlement had provided the necessary preconditions. That model is wrong. Göbekli Tepe has proven it wrong, but the revision has not yet fully made its way into school curricula, popular history books, or the general cultural understanding of who early humans were. So here is the thing that they do not widely advertise, packaged as clearly as possible. The standard story of human civilization is wrong, not slightly off, not missing a few details, wrong at a foundational level. And the proof is a hill in southeastern Turkey that has been staring up at the sky for 12,000 years, waiting for someone to finish digging it up and tell the world what was there. There is one dimension of Göbekli Tepe that gets remarkably little attention given how important it is, and that dimension is language. The builders of Göbekli Tepe communicated with each other. There is no question about this. You cannot organize the construction of 20 or more enclosures containing hundreds of multi-ton stone pillars, spread across a period of 1,500 years, without a sophisticated means of communication. You cannot maintain a consistent visual vocabulary of specific animal imagery and abstract geometric symbols across a wide geographic area and across multiple generations, without some means of preserving and transmitting that vocabulary. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe spoke to each other. They debated, instructed, argued, prayed, perhaps chanted or sang. Whatever rituals took place within those stone enclosures had verbal components, words, formulas, invocations, stories. None of that survives. It cannot. Language in this period was entirely oral. No writing for another 6,000 years. What the builders of Göbekli Tepe said to each other in the darkness of those enclosures, what names they gave to the beings depicted on their pillars, what prayers or invocations they directed at those central figures, what myths explained the meaning of the scorpion below the vulture on Pillar 43, all of it evaporated into the air the moment it was spoken. The stone carvings remain. The words are gone. But the carvings themselves are evidence of a rich narrative tradition. The deliberate, consistent pairing of specific animals and symbols across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures. The spatial relationships between elements within a single carved composition. The specific choice to depict headless human bodies in relation to vultures. These are the marks of a storytelling culture. The carvers were not working at random. They were depicting things that their audience recognized within a shared framework of story and meaning. The carved surfaces of Göbekli Tepe are, in the most literal sense, illustrated mythology, the world's oldest illustrated mythology. And the mythology they illustrate is entirely lost to us. That loss is profound. And it is also a reminder of how much of human experience across the vast sweep of our species' history has simply vanished, has been spoken into the air and carried away on the wind, leaving only the stone and the bone and the shaped earth behind. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest surviving monument of a tradition of meaning-making that was already old when the first pillar was raised. The questions those people were asking about the cosmos, about death, about the forces that govern the world, about what we owe to the dead, are questions that have never stopped being asked. They are being asked right now in 1,000 different languages, in 1,000 different forms, by a species that is still, after all this time, trying to figure out the same things. Let us pull back now and think about the bigger picture. Because Göbekli Tepe is not just a fascinating archaeological site. It is a piece of evidence about something that matters on a deeper level than the history of any single civilization. It is evidence about the nature of the human mind and about how far back certain capacities of that mind actually go. For a long time, the story we told ourselves about our own species went something like this. For most of human history, we were basically just surviving, focused on the practical necessities of staying alive, finding food, staying warm, avoiding predators. The higher order stuff, the art, the religion, the philosophy, the organized collective effort toward goals beyond immediate survival, all of that was relatively recent, a product of the settled, comfortable life that agriculture eventually made possible. Before that comfort, before that stability, we did not have much room for anything beyond the basics. Göbekli Tepe says otherwise. It says that 11,500 years ago, before farming, before pottery, before writing, before any of the infrastructure we associate with complex civilization, human beings were already engaging with the fundamental questions of existence in a sophisticated, organized, permanent way. They were already asking about death, already building cosmologies, already organizing large groups around shared beliefs, already creating detailed symbolic systems that transmitted meaning across generations and across distance. They were already, in the fullest sense, us. That revision matters. It matters because the story we tell about our origins shapes, in subtle but real ways, how we understand ourselves in the present. If we believe that art and religion and collective meaning-making are relatively recent additions to the human toolkit, luxuries that arose from comfort and stability, then we implicitly treat them as somewhat contingent, somewhat fragile, somewhat dependent on the right conditions. But if we know that those capacities were present before any of those conditions existed, that they may in fact have been the engine that created those conditions rather than a product of them, then we are looking at something that goes much deeper into our nature. Something that is not a luxury or an add-on, but a fundamental feature of what we are. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not proto-humans struggling towards civilization. They were fully modern human beings, as cognitively capable and emotionally complex as any human alive today. The gap between them and us is not a gap of capability. It is a gap of accumulated knowledge, accumulated technology, accumulated written memory. They did not have what 12,000 years of cumulative human discovery has given us. But they had what we had at the beginning, the raw material of human consciousness, the hunger for meaning, the capacity for awe, the drive to build something that outlasts a single life. And they used it to raise 50-ton pillars on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey and carve snakes and foxes and vultures into the stone and gather in circles to do something that, whatever word you attach to it, was clearly important enough to dedicate generations of collective effort to. That is not primitive. That is not simple. That is human. If there is one lesson that honest engagement with the story of Göbekli Tepe should leave you with, it is that our understanding of this site and of the broader pre-Neolithic cultural world it belongs to is radically, almost embarrassingly incomplete. We have learned an extraordinary amount since Klaus Schmidt first walked that ridge in 1994, but the ratio of what we know to what we do not know remains humbling. There are at least 15 to 16 completely unexcavated enclosures still buried beneath Potbelly Hill. Each one may contain carvings, artifacts, architectural features, and ritual materials that we have never seen. The deeper layers of the site, the earliest phases of occupation, the periods that preceded even Enclosure D, have been barely touched. We do not know the names those people gave to the beings on the pillars. We do not know what language they spoke, or whether it was ancestral to any language still spoken today. We do not know exactly what happened inside the enclosures during the rituals performed there. Whether those rituals involved feasting and communal meals, music and movement, altered states of consciousness, the public display of modified skulls, astronomical observation timed to specific celestial events, or some combination of all of these and more that we have not yet imagined. We do not know why the site was ultimately abandoned, whether it was a gradual process connected to the spread of agriculture, or whether there was a more specific, more dramatic reason for the end of activity here. The Younger Drios impact hypothesis and its relationship to the carvings on Pillar 43 remains an open, contested, important question. More geological evidence for a major impact event around 10,950 BCE continues to be published. More astronomical analysis of the pillar's imagery continues to be produced. Whether the hypothesis is eventually confirmed or refuted, the question of what that carved surface was intended to communicate has not been settled, and will not be settled quickly. The Taş-Tepeler network of related sites is only beginning to be systematically understood. Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Harbetsuvan, and all their sister sites each have their own stories buried in their own layers of ancient soil. Taken together, this network represents an entire cultural world, a pre-Neolithic civilization in everything but name, that humanity has essentially just discovered. The work of understanding it is a project that will span multiple generations of researchers, multiple decades of fieldwork, and probably multiple fundamental revisions of whatever conclusions seem most secure right now. And somewhere in the world, beneath soils and sediments we have not yet thought to examine carefully, there may be more. There may be sites as old as Göbekli Tepe or older that have not been found yet, or that have been found but not yet recognized for what they are. Because sometimes you look at the top of a prehistoric megalith and see an ordinary grave marker, and it takes 3 decades and the right set of eyes before anyone knows what they are actually looking at. The story of human prehistory is not finished. It is not settled. The standard narrative has been broken open, and what fills the gap it has left is not fully known yet. But whatever fills that gap is older and stranger and more deeply human than the old story allowed. Somewhere beneath a hill in southeastern Turkey, carved into limestone by hands that moved 11,000 years ago, the next piece of the answer is waiting. In the dark, patient as stone, as it has always been. If this video made you think, made you question something you thought you knew, or made you feel even a little bit of the vertigo that comes from staring down the full depth of human history, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit that like button, subscribe to Dreamtime Documents, turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive, because the questions we ask here are not small ones, and we are just getting started. Good night.